50 cars filled with Ku Klux Klan members rolled through Monroe, North Carolina, led by the town's own police chief. Their target, a brick house where Marine Corps veteran Robert F. Williams and a group of black World War II soldiers waited. The Klan had terrorized this neighborhood for months, but tonight, black men would shoot back. Monroe, North Carolina sat 30 miles southeast of Charlotte, a small textile town of 12,000 people where cotton mills provided jobs and Jim Crow provided the rules. The railroad tracks divided white from black, prosperity from poverty, safety from terror. On one side lived the people who ran the town, on the other lived the people who kept it running, cooking in white kitchens, cleaning white homes, working white-owned factories for a fraction of white wages. Robert Franklin Williams arrived back in Monroe in 1955, though calling it an arrival suggests he'd been welcome somewhere else. Born in this town on February 26, 1925, he'd grown up hearing stories from his grandmother, a former slave who'd given him his grandfather's rifle and told him what it meant to survive in a place that wanted you dead. His grandfather had been a Republican organizer during Reconstruction, publishing a newspaper called The People's Voice, until white violence made him choose between his voice and his life. He chose life, but kept the rifle. Williams knew Monroe's particular brand of hatred intimately. When he was 11 years old, he'd watched police officer Jesse Helms Sr., father of the future senator, drag a black woman bleeding through the streets by her hair after administering what the officer called an arrest. The woman's screams echoed in Williams' head for years. The sight of that badge glinting in the sun, while white onlookers smiled and nodded, taught young Robert a lesson that no school would ever address. The law in Monroe wasn't there to protect him. It was there to remind him of his place. He'd tried to escape that place. During World War II, Williams migrated north like hundreds of thousands of other black Southerners, finding work in Detroit's auto factories. He was there in 1943 when white mobs stormed through black neighborhoods, killing dozens. He fought back then, young and angry, learning that Northern freedom was just Southern oppression with better lighting. In 1944, he was drafted into the Army, serving until 1946. Then he joined the Marines, 1954 to 1955, where he learned discipline, marksmanship, and the bitter irony of defending a country that wouldn't defend him. When he returned to Monroe in 1955, he found the local National Association for the Advancement of Colored People chapter gasping its last breath. 6 members remained, from what had once been a thriving organization. The others had been fired from jobs, threatened, beaten, driven out. Southern states were systematically destroying the NAACP, branding it communist, outlawing it where they could. In Monroe, simply attending a meeting could cost you everything. Williams started recruiting, not from the middle-class teachers and preachers who typically led NAACP chapters. He went to the factories, the farms, the unemployed men standing on corners. Most importantly, he went to the veterans, men who'd seen combat, who'd been trained to fight, who'd tasted just enough equality in uniform to make segregation unbearable when they came home. Men like Dr. Albert Perry. Dr. Albert E. Perry was everything Monroe's white establishment wanted to deny could exist. A black man with a medical degree, a veteran, a practicing physician at the local hospital. He bought a nice brick house, drove a decent car, and had the audacity to act like he deserved respect. Williams made him vice president of the Monroe NAACP. Together, they set about picking fights the previous leadership would never have dared to start. Their first victory came quiet. In 1956, they integrated the public library. White Monroe barely noticed because white Monroe barely used the library, but Williams and Perry noticed. They'd proven that pressure worked, that the system could be moved, so they picked a target that mattered more, the swimming pool. In the summer of 1957, 2 black children drowned in a creek. There was nowhere else for them to swim. Monroe's public pool, built with federal tax dollars that black families paid just like white families, was reserved exclusively for white residents. Black children had to make do with unsupervised creeks, muddy rivers, and the consequences that came with them. 2 children went under and didn't come up. Their names were lost to history, but their deaths sparked something that wouldn't be forgotten. Williams went to the city council with a reasonable request. Open the pool to black children 1 day a week, just 1 day. The council's response was a masterclass in creative racism. Draining and refilling the pool after black people used it, they explained with straight faces, would simply be too expensive. Segregation, they suggested, was an economic necessity. Williams had a different analysis. Standing before the council, he delivered a line that cut through Monroe's polite racism like a blade. Segregation, he said, is a luxury that Monroe cannot afford. He organized picket lines. 8 people at first, standing at the pool gates, silent, peaceful, exactly the kind of protest that Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching across the South. And Monroe responded the way Monroe always responded, with violence. Shots rang out at the picket lines. No one was arrested. Law enforcement officers stood by and watched. The message was clear. You can protest all you want, but when the bullets fly, you're on your own. That's when the Ku Klux Klan got involved. The Klan in Monroe wasn't some fringe element hiding in the shadows. In a town of 12,000 people, the press estimated 7,500 Klan members and supporters, more than half the town. They held massive rallies where thousands gathered in their robes and hoods. Listening to speakers promised to keep Monroe pure, to keep the races separate, to handle these uppity agitators who thought they deserved to swim in white water. Leading these rallies was James William Catfish Cole, a South Carolina Klan organizer who'd made Monroe his personal project. Cole was the Klan's regional heavyweight, a man who commanded respect in white supremacist circles, someone who got things done. He held rallies where he specifically named Williams and Perry, calling them communists, troublemakers, threats to the Southern way of life. Then his followers would pile into their cars and form motorcades. Here's where the institutional betrayal became impossible to ignore. Monroe's police chief, A.A. Morney, didn't try to stop these motorcades. He led them. Squad cars with flashing lights would escort 50, sometimes more, Klan vehicles through Monroe's streets. The procession would wind through town, then head across the railroad tracks into Newtown, the black section, and there they'd drive past specific houses, firing guns into windows, throwing bottles, shouting threats, while the police chief made sure they had safe passage. Dr. Perry's house became a favorite target. Night after night, the motorcade would roll past, and gunfire would erupt. Perry, his wife, his children, huddling inside while bullets punched through walls. He'd call the police. They'd tell him they couldn't confirm any shooting had occurred, despite the holes in his house and the shell casings in his yard. Then they'd suggest perhaps he'd be safer if he stopped causing trouble. Williams made a decision that would define his life and split the civil rights movement. If the law wouldn't protect black people would protect themselves. He applied for a charter from the National Rifle Association. The NRA approved it without hesitation. Williams formed what he called the Black Armed Guard, though officially it was the Monroe chapter of the NRA. 50 to 60 men, most of them veterans like Williams, men who knew how to handle weapons, how to maintain discipline under fire, how to return fire effectively. They trained, they drilled, they bought guns with money raised from supporters, including fundraisers in Harlem, where Malcolm X would later invite Williams to speak at his mosque. They studied tactics, and they prepared Dr. Perry's house like it was a forward operating base. By October 1957, tensions in Monroe had reached a breaking point. The Klan's motorcades continued, increasingly brazen. White Monroe had circulated petitions to have Williams and Perry driven from town. Anonymous death threats arrived daily. Williams' insurance company cancelled his coverage, citing the risk. When he asked the police chief why his insurance was cancelled if there was no danger, the chief had no answer. On October 5th, 1957, the Klan decided to make their point permanent. They were going to Dr. Perry's house, and this time they weren't just going to shoot at it. They were going to burn it down with everyone inside. Williams got word through the Black Communities Network. People who worked in white homes, who overheard conversations, who understood that information meant survival. The Klan was coming, in force. Tonight. Williams and his men moved into Perry's house that afternoon. They stacked sandbags along the windows. They positioned men with clear fields of fire. They made sure everyone understood the plan. No one fires first, but when they do fire, we fire back. Aim low. Disable. Don't kill if possible. Make it clear we're serious without giving them martyrs. As the sun set, they waited. Perry's family had been moved to safety. Inside the house were only men who'd made peace with what might happen next. Veterans who'd survived war only to find themselves at war in their own hometown. Men who'd sworn oaths to defend their country and were now defending their community from their neighbors. The sound reached them first. Engines. Lots of engines. Then the glow of headlights. Dozens of them, winding through Monroe's streets. The motorcade rolled past City Hall, past the courthouse, past the nice white neighborhoods where people watched from their porches like it was a parade. Then it crossed the tracks into Newtown, 50 cars or more, packed with Klan members in full regalia. At the front, Monroe Police Chief Morney's squad car, lights flashing. The motorcade snaked through Newtown streets, and residents who'd seen this before pulled their children inside, turned off their lights, prayed this night wouldn't be the night someone they loved got killed. The procession turned onto Perry Street. The cars slowed, then stopped, engines idling. Men began to emerge, white robes gleaming in the headlights. Some carried torches, some carried guns. All of them carried the certainty that this was their town, their right, their prerogative to do as they pleased. Then the shooting started. Later, both sides would claim the other fired first. What's certain is that gunfire erupted from the Klan's motorcade, slamming into Perry's house. Bullets shattered windows, punched through the brick, tore through the front door. The roar was deafening, dozens of weapons firing at once. Inside the house, Williams gave the order. Fire! The response was disciplined, controlled, exactly what you'd expect from trained soldiers. Muzzle flashes erupted from Perry's windows. The veterans inside had positioned themselves for overlapping fields of fire. They aimed low, at car tires, at legs, at anything that wasn't lethal but would make their point crystal clear. The Klan had never experienced this. In all their years of terrorizing black neighborhoods, shooting into homes, burning crosses, inflicting violence with impunity, they'd never faced organized armed resistance. The psychological impact was immediate and total. These weren't victims cowering in the dark. These were soldiers returning fire. The Klan panicked. Men in white robes scrambled back to their cars. Engines roared to life. Tires squealed. The entire motorcade broke formation and fled in every direction, some cars running into each other in their desperation to escape. Within minutes, the street was empty except for abandoned robes, dropped torches, and the fading sound of engines racing back across the tracks to the safety of white Monroe. Inside Perry's house, Williams and his men held their positions. No pursuit, no celebration. They maintained their perimeter through the night, knowing retaliation might come. But it didn't. The Klan had been routed, humiliated, driven from a black neighborhood by black men with guns. The next morning, Monroe's city council held an emergency session. The same council that had said they couldn't afford to let black children swim. The same council that had turned a blind eye to months of Klan terrorism. They passed an ordinance effective immediately. The Ku Klux Klan was banned from Monroe without a special permit from the police chief. That ordinance was the first crack in Monroe's wall of white supremacy. Not because the council suddenly developed a conscience, but because armed black veterans had demonstrated something white Monroe couldn't afford to ignore. In Williams' own words, racists consider themselves superior beings and are not willing to exchange their superior lives for our inferior ones. They are most vicious and violent when they can practice violence with impunity. The shootout barely made the news. The Monroe Journal mentioned it briefly. 3 black newspapers covered it. The national press ignored it completely. Just 3 months later, when the Lumbee tribe would rout the Klan in a similar confrontation, national media would descend on North Carolina, Life magazine would run photo spreads, politicians would issue statements. But when black men defended themselves with guns, white America decided that story was better left untold. Williams understood why. As he'd later write, the national press played up the Indian Klan fight because they didn't consider this a great threat. The Indians are a tiny minority, and people could laugh at the incident as a sentimental joke. But no one wanted black people to get the impression that this was an accepted way to deal with the Klan. So the white press maintained a complete blackout about our fight. But word spread through black communities across the South. Veterans heard what had happened in Monroe. Working people heard. Young activists heard. The message was clear. Nonviolence was a tactic, not a suicide pact. You could advocate for peace while keeping a rifle behind the door. The October 5th. Shootout didn't end Monroe's racial violence, but it fundamentally changed its character. The Klan never conducted another motorcade through Newtown. They couldn't. They'd been exposed as cowards who only fought when resistance was impossible. When black men shot back, they ran. Less than a month later, the Klan tried a different approach. If they couldn't eliminate the troublemakers by force, they'd eliminate them through the legal system. Dr. Perry was arrested on charges of performing an abortion on a white woman. The accusation was almost certainly false. Perry was Catholic. opposed to abortion on religious grounds. The woman herself said she'd asked him to perform the procedure, but that he'd refused. None of that mattered. The newspaper headline screamed, "Negro doctor arrested for criminal abortion on white woman." The racism was coded into every word. A black man's hands on a white woman's body, even in a medical context, was treated as inherently criminal. Perry was jailed. Williams led armed demonstrations at the courthouse, hundreds of black residents openly carrying weapons, demanding Perry's release. A white benefactor posted $7,000 bond. Perry was freed, but the damage was done. His trial came almost exactly a year after his arrest, October 21st, 1958. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Released after serving just over a year, Dr. Albert E. Perry never got his medical license back. He'd lost his profession, his livelihood, his future, for the crime of standing up to the Klan. The system had accomplished through legal proceedings what the Klan couldn't accomplish with guns. Meanwhile, Williams faced his own reckoning with the broader civil rights movement. In late October 1958, just days after Perry's conviction, a case exploded that would make Williams an international figure. 2 black boys, 9-year-old James Hanover Thompson and 7-year-old David Fuzzy Simpson, had been playing with white children. During a kissing game, a 7-year-old white girl named Sissy Sutton kissed both boys on the cheek. When she mentioned it to her mother, white Monroe reacted with hysterical rage. The mother washed her daughter's mouth with lye. Armed men hunted for the boys. Police arrested James and David, handcuffed them, took them to jail, and spent 6 days interrogating them without allowing them access to parents or lawyers. They were beaten, threatened with lynching, told they'd raped a white girl. Judge Hampton Price heard the case. Such as it was, the boys had no legal representation. They stood silent, terrified. The judge interpreted their silence as a confession. He sentenced both boys to indefinite terms in reform school, possibly until age 21, for a kiss that a white girl had initiated. Williams mobilized international attention. He contacted journalists in Europe. He worked with activists in New York to form the Committee to Combat Racial Injustice. He turned the kissing case into a global embarrassment for the United States, with demonstrations in Paris, Rome, and Vienna. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt intervened with North Carolina's governor. President Eisenhower received thousands of letters. After 3 months, on February 13, 1959, Governor Luther Hodges pardoned the boys without explanation or apology. They were released. Their lives were destroyed. James Thompson would spend most of his adult life in and out of prison. David Simpson largely disappeared from the record. In 2011 interviews, James's sister Brenda would remember sweeping bullets off their front porch every morning while the Klan burned crosses in their yard. The kissing case made Williams famous, but it also made him a target. Then came the event that would force him into exile. In May 1959, a Monroe court heard the case of Mary Ruth Reed, a 23-year-old black woman who was 8 months pregnant when Louis Medlin, a white man, assaulted her and attempted to rape her. Medlin was charged. The trial was brief. The all-white jury deliberated briefly, not guilty. Williams stood on the courthouse steps as Medlin walked free, and he said something that would end his leadership of the Monroe NAACP. Black women approached him, devastated, asking what they were supposed to do now that white men knew they could assault black women with impunity. Williams told them, "We cannot rely on the law. We must defend ourselves. If it takes violence to get justice, then we must meet violence with violence." The next day, National NAACP head Roy Wilkins called. Williams confirmed he'd made the statement and would repeat it. Within hours, Wilkins suspended Williams from the NAACP for 6 months. The organization Williams had rebuilt from 6 members to hundreds, the chapter that had achieved what no other Southern NAACP chapter had dared attempt, was now too militant, too aggressive, too willing to fight back. Williams didn't stop. He founded a newsletter, The Crusader, continuing his grandfather's tradition of publishing. He continued organizing. In 1961, when Freedom Riders came to Monroe, Williams' armed guards protected them. When white mobs attacked non-violent demonstrators, Williams' men formed defensive perimeters. Martin Luther King Jr. refused to visit Monroe, specifically because Williams' armed guards were there. The philosophical divide between non-violence and self-defense had become irreconcilable. On August 27, 1961, violence erupted in Monroe again. Freedom Riders had been demonstrating. White mobs attacked. In the chaos, a white couple from a nearby town, Bruce and Mabel Stegall, drove into Newtown by accident. Residents surrounded their car, thinking it was part of the mob. Williams personally intervened, brought the couple into his own home for protection, kept them safe for 2 hours until tensions cooled, and they could leave unharmed. The Steggalls left safely. Then Monroe Police Chief Morney, the same man who'd led KKK motorcades, told Williams, "In 30 minutes, you'll be hanging in the courthouse square." The FBI issued a federal warrant for Williams' arrest on kidnapping charges. The couple he'd protected claimed he'd held them hostage. Williams knew what was coming. Monroe's law enforcement, which had never arrested a single Klansman for terrorizing black neighborhoods, was about to lynch him legally. He and his wife Mabel fled, first to Canada, then to Cuba, then to China. He wouldn't return to the United States until 1969. From exile in Cuba, Williams broadcast Radio Free Dixie, a weekly program featuring jazz, blues, news, and commentary directed at black listeners in the American South. He wrote his book, Negroes with Guns, published in 1962, which would become essential reading for a new generation of activists. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale would cite it as inspiration for the Black Panther Party, the idea that black people had the right to defend themselves with weapons, that armed resistance was a legitimate response to armed oppression. Spread through the Black Power movement of the late 60s, the kidnapping charges were finally dropped in 1975. Williams returned to Michigan, where he lived quietly until October 15, 1996, when he died of Hodgkin's lymphoma at age 71. Rosa Parks delivered his eulogy in Monroe, the town that had driven him into exile for daring to suggest black people deserved to swim in public pools. The night of October 5, 1957, changed nothing and everything. Monroe remained segregated. The Klan remained powerful. Racism remained the law, but something had shifted. Black men with military training had demonstrated that white supremacist violence wasn't cost-free. They'd shown that victims could become defenders, that terror could be met with resistance, that the oppressed didn't have to die quietly. History tried to forget that night. The civil rights narrative we teach emphasizes non-violence, peaceful protest, moral suasion. We celebrate the bus boycotts and sit-ins, the marches and speeches. We're less comfortable acknowledging that sometimes black people survived because they had guns and knew how to use them, that veterans who'd fought fascism overseas came home and fought it at home, that the Klan stopped terrorizing certain neighborhoods because they knew armed men waited in the darkness. Robert F. Williams never apologized for October 5th. In his book, he wrote, "It has always been an accepted right of Americans, as the history of our western states proves, that where the law is unable to enforce order, the citizens can and must act in self-defense. We asserted this right, and we did what the law officers refused to do. We stopped the terror. We stopped it permanently." The Monroe shootout poses an uncomfortable question for American history. How much of the progress we credit to moral appeals actually came from the threat of armed resistance? How many white supremacists backed down not because they'd seen the light, but because they'd seen what happened when black veterans shot back? How much of the civil rights movement's success depended on the unspoken pressure of men like Williams, proving that black communities could defend themselves if pushed too far? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that after October 5, 1957, the Klan never conducted another armed motorcade through Monroe's black neighborhoods. We know that the city council passed an anti-Klan ordinance the very next morning after refusing to act for months. We know that white Monroe's terrorism lost its impunity. And we know that black veterans, men who'd been told they weren't good enough to swim in public pools, proved they were more than good enough to stand their ground when armed mobs came calling. The story of that night, and the man who organized the resistance, deserves more than a footnote. It deserves to be told in full as a reminder that justice in America has often been extracted at gunpoint by people who refused to die quietly. Robert F. Williams and his men didn't start the violence in Monroe. They just finished it.